Hello everyone. Welcome to the keynote session of Korea Foundation's third Public Diplomacy Week. My name is Kadir Jun Ayhan. I am a professor of international relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Today we are honored to host Professor Jo셉nai as our keynote speaker. Dr. Nye needs no introduction. He is a University Distinguished Service Professor and former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Dr. Nye served as a Deputy Undersecretary of State, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs for the US government. He authored 14 academic books, including Soft Power, The Future of Power, and most recently, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Jo셉nai to deliver his keynote remarks. Dr. Nye?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to join you and to discuss the way the pandemic has affected the environment for soft power and public diplomacy. If you ask how we think about soft power, remember that it's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And so in that sense, with the pandemic affecting everyone and on top of everyone's agenda, there are really two major ways in which it affects soft power. One is by enhancing or undercutting a country's reputation for competence. Countries are often attracted to others when they feel that the other country is particularly competent, does a very good job. And in that sense, for example, countries which show that they have mastered the pandemic well, such as South Korea, gain in soft power from that. The other way in which the pandemic affects soft power is by attraction. And the attraction comes when you are cooperative or when you help others. In other words, if you develop a benign image through cooperation, then you're likely to enhance your soft power. And in that sense, competence and cooperation are the two major ways in which the pandemic has affected the environment for soft power and public diplomacy. Unfortunately, the United States has shown a failure on both of these dimensions, both on the competence, where we have not done well, and also on cooperation, where we have not done well. So that brings me to the question of which countries have done better in public diplomacy and global leadership, and what accounts for their success or failure. I think we should start with the US and China, which are the two largest economies in the world. And I would argue that both countries have failed in their leadership. Both essentially initially turned to denial, and China used censorship and trying to prevent full information about what was happening in Wuhan. When the virus reached the United States, President Trump initially compared it to the flu and said it would soon go away. And then after denial, in both cases, they turned to blame shifting. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesman blamed the U.S. For the virus in Wuhan, which was nonsense, but it's a good example of blame shifting. And Donald Trump blamed China and the WHO for all the problems in the United States. And while it's true that there's good evidence that the virus began in Wuhan, many of the ways in which it spread and the failure to cope with it were made in America, not just in China. So in that sense, I think both countries, both the two largest economies in the world, lost a certain amount of soft power through their lack of competence and their lack of cooperation in the early stages. Now, I think what's interesting is whether they can recover from this. Can they recover their soft power? China has been making a major effort to do so. One thing it's been able to recover is a sense of competence. It seems to have done a much better job of getting the virus under control. It's also tried to engage in a diplomatic offensive, a public diplomacy offensive that's sometimes called face mask diplomacy, appearing to be cooperative by providing medical equipment such as face masks. But most of the public opinion polls show that people don't particularly trust this. And one of the problems that China has is that its campaign efforts, its public diplomacy campaign efforts in the aftermath of the pandemic run into two major problems that affect Chinese soft power and public diplomacy more generally. One is the fact that China has a number of disputes with its neighbors. So, for example, China has a dispute with India, as well as with Vietnam, Japan, and so forth. It's very hard to combine face mask diplomacy with what's sometimes called wolf warrior diplomacy. China has had a clash between its troops with Indian troops on the border in the Himalayas, and that has clearly hurt Chinese soft power far more than any face mask diplomacy could repair. The other general problem that China has with its soft power is its insistence on tight party control over all groups in civil society. So China basically does not allow the freedom of discussion or the independent initiative of private groups that you would find in a democratic country like Korea. In that sense, China will recover some soft power, perhaps, but it faces these two large problems for its soft power and public diplomacy. The United States, I think, faces the problem that President Trump has been very much a inconsistent and narrow leader in the way he's approached cooperation with other countries. We don't have any border disputes with our neighbors, but certainly in terms of cooperation, Trump has failed. On the other hand, if you find that there is a change in the presidency after the November elections, it may be possible that the Americans will be able to recover some of their soft power. They've done so in the past. For example, in the 1970s, U.S. government policy toward Vietnam was wildly unpopular all around the world. And in that sense, people were marching in the streets against the U.S. But the interesting thing to notice is that they were not marching and singing the song, the Internationale. They were singing Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. So an anthem from American civil society indicated that the ability of the Americans to be self-critical and to have a vibrant civil society was a basis for restoring soft power. And within a decade after the Vietnam War, American soft power had pretty well returned to the levels before. So I think the chances of restoring soft power in the aftermath of the pandemic remain a reasonable prospect, though I think it will be very much affected by the question of whether there's a change in the presidency. And that brings me to the third question, which is how can we make soft power more collaborative rather than seeing it only as competitive? And how, in particular, can Korea contribute to this? In the book you mentioned, Do Morals Matter, my new book about presidents and foreign policy, I point out that there are a number of transnational issues which cross borders outside the control of governments, where we have to change the way we think about power. We have to change from thinking about power over others and thinking about power with others. Issues like climate change, for example, cannot be solved by any one country acting alone. China is the major producer today of carbon dioxide, and the U.S. can't solve the climate issue unless it cooperates with China. And the same way, China can't solve the climate problem, which will hurt China when the glaciers in the Himalayas melt and climate changes and hurts agriculture and raises sea levels and so forth. China can't solve that without cooperating with the U.S. and with Korea and with Japan and Europe and so forth. So we have to rethink power in these issues and feel more tuned to power with others, not just over others. Now, in that sense, if you relate that to the pandemic, you'll see that when President Trump went and responded to the pandemic in the narrow transactional ways that he did, the problem was that not that he said America first as a slogan. Almost all elected leaders have to put their national interests first. After all, they're the trustee for the people who elected them. But what I point out in Do Morals Matter, it's not whether you defend the national interest, it's how you define the national interest. And you can define it narrowly or you can define it broadly. Trump has essentially taken a narrow transactional definition, whereas it could have been possible to have a broad definition. The example I give from my book is the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, where the Americans gave away more than 2% of their gross domestic product. It was good for the Europeans, obviously. It was also good for the Americans because it helped us at the same time that it helped the Europeans. And that could be the case that we could think of in terms of soft power and the question of the pandemic. Suppose that Trump had agreed to support a Marshall Plan for poor countries with inadequate public health systems. Suppose that we had helped to lead, for example, the Group of 20, which would, of course, include South Korea, and developing a large COVID fund to help these poor countries develop their public health systems. That would have been a very different approach to defining the American interest, rather than thinking of it simply as in the narrow terms that Trump had. After all, the coronavirus doesn't kill it doesn't matter what kind of human beings it kills. And if we have reservoirs of the coronavirus in southern countries, southern hemisphere countries with inadequate public health systems, those reservoirs will overflow and hurt those of us in the northern hemisphere. So the reason to have a Marshall Plan for COVID along the lines I described is that it's good for us as well as good for them. But it would also do a great deal to enhance our soft power by showing that we were both competent and cooperative, to go back to my earlier points. So what will happen now? We don't know, but it's possible that if there is a change in government in the U.S. and that a Biden presidency looks at the situation, it may avoid what's called vaccine nationalism. You could imagine a Biden presidency saying we will reserve a certain amount of that vaccine for health responders in poor countries with inadequate public health systems, and we'll lead an international effort to do that. if that's the case, South Korea would play a very important role, not merely because it had developed and demonstrated competence, but also because it has the wherewithal to help make a significant contribution to something like a COVID fund or the World Health Organization's COVAX facility for helping poor countries get access to vaccines. So in that sense, I think what I would hope might happen is that after the American elections, there will be a change and that we will define the national interest in broader terms and working along with allies, including, of course, South Korea, we will start to see this as a situation which requires attention to power with others, not just power over others. And that will be good for the soft power of the United States, good for the soft power of South Korea, and good for the soft power of China if China decides to join in that program. So that would be my hope for how we might see the pandemic affecting soft power and public diplomacy. But I have to admit that so far we have not seen that. So let me stop there and turn it back to you and to the questions from students.
Thank you ever so much, Dr. Nye, for your very insightful remarks. Now, in this part of the keynote session, I would like to ask you a few questions. In every opportunity it gets, China suggests that it embraces the underlying norms of the current liberal world order, particularly regarding free trade, multilateralism, and international cooperation. Do you think COVID-19 has become an opportunity for China to show that it is ready to share the burden of provision of global public goods and be a true global leader? For more than a decade, and you also mentioned this in your remarks, you talked about power with, and you suggest that the US must simultaneously compete and cooperate with China. How can the US wield power with a more assertive China to accomplish joint goals while competing with it on other grounds?
Well, I think the important thing is to realize that the relationship between the United States and China is what I call a cooperative rivalry. In other words, it's not all friendship and it's not all enmity. There are some areas where we're going to have differences. For example, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, where the law of the sea tribunal in The Hague has said that China's position violates the law, and the Americans send freedom of navigation operations through the waters which the Hague Tribunal declares are international waters, and China resists this. That is power over. I mean, that is competition. That's not going to go away. But at the same time, for the United States to pull out of the World Health Organization and to not join the WHO's COVAX facility, while China has joined it, is a missed opportunity for cooperation. Similarly, we should be working with Chinese scientists to try to understand more about the origins and nature of this coronavirus so that we can protect against next waves of it and also prepare for the next virus, which we can be sure will come. This is not the last time we'll see a pandemic. So we're going to have to learn to compete and cooperate simultaneously. And that's often hard. People like to say it's all black or it's all white. In fact, we're going to find that in many of these issues, they're going to be in the gray zone.
Earlier you mentioned about your recent book, Do Morals Matter? And congratulations, by the way, on your recent publication. I think it's almost a book a year nowadays for you, and very good for us as well. In this recent book, Do Morals Matter? You talk about morality in three dimensions: intentions, means, and consequences. What does morality in foreign policy mean for the post-pandemic global leadership? And how would you evaluate different actors' recent foreign policies in terms of these three dimensions? For example, if you would evaluate them the same way you evaluated US presidents using your scorecard.
Well, very often people will say that if you have good intentions, that's a moral foreign policy. For example, when President George W. Bush invaded Iraq, his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, said, well, you had to give him credit for moral foreign policy because he wanted to produce freedom and democracy in Iraq and in the Middle East. But that is a shallow version of moral reasoning. Just because you have good intention doesn't mean the action is moral. There's a proverb that says the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So we have to look at the other two dimensions of judging moral actions. Not merely is it something which you intend well, but did you pay appropriate attention to the means and choose moral means? And did you have good consequences? Did you think through the prospect of unintended consequences to make sure that there was a reasonable prospect of success? So that's why I say you need three-dimensional morality, intentions, means, and consequences before you have a moral foreign policy. When it comes to the pandemic, I think you could say that the intentions to try to suppress the pandemic, to save lives, these are obviously good intentions. But the means, if you choose means that are narrowly nationalistic and that prevent cooperation with others, such as the American Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization, those are inappropriate means. Those are means which don't fit the definition of morality. And similarly, in terms of consequences, one has to think not just of consequences for the U.S., but for others as well. And that failure to think through possible unintended consequences of taking a narrow nationalistic view of the questions of the effects of the pandemic, and not to realize that you can't have your own country safe unless other countries are safe as well, that means you're not going to succeed in what you're trying to do. So in terms of judging intentions, means, and consequences, I'll grant that perhaps President Trump has had good intentions to try to suppress the virus, but not good means and consequences.
And in your 2011 book, The Future of Power, you talk about a complex three-dimensional chess game, where you elaborate power distribution in world politics today. There you differentiate between unipolarity in terms of military power, multipolarity in terms of economic power, and a widely diffused power distribution in the realm of transnational relations. In a similar vein, Amitav Acharya calls the current world order a multiplex world order, where different transnational actors are authorities and play leadership roles in different global governance issue areas. For example, today, France is one of the leading countries in climate change efforts, while the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one of the most authoritative actors in the field of global health governance. With the ongoing pandemic, we see many countries, including South Korea, aiming to lead efforts in international collaboration to address the pandemic. Do you think these trends suggest transformation of global leadership from American hegemony to the leadership of various global governors in different issue areas?
Well, I think, again, to go back to that three dimensions of the chessboard, in terms of military power, I think the United States will remain the dominant power for decades to come. In terms of economic power, the world is already multipolar, not just the U.S., but also China, Europe, and others, Japan, and so forth. And in terms of transnational relations, there is the diffusion of power that you referred to. The more important the transnational issues become on the agenda, the more it's going to require cooperative leadership. So to talk about hegemony, let's say, might make some sense in the military area, but to talk about it in the economic or the transnational area doesn't make much sense. You can't really solve a problem like climate change or like the problems of the current COVID pandemic or future pandemics to come by thinking any one government can be hegemonic. It can't be. So I think that leadership on these issues is going to have to be shared. And it's not that Chinese hegemony will replace the American hegemony or something of that sort. It's that the Americans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Europeans, the Koreans, everybody is going to have to learn to cooperate to deal with these transnational issues.
And where do you think transnational actors would fit in, such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in line with these countries?
I think they play a very important role. If you look at the questions, for example, just related to the pandemic, the questions of vaccines, the non-governmental Gavi organization, the Global Alliance for Vaccinations, is extremely important. If you look at the questions of networks of scientists which are working together to share information to better understand pandemics, some of this is supported through intergovernmental organizations like the World Health Organization. Some of it is through various academies of science and informal networks of scientists. So I think you're just going to find more and more role for these various non-governmental actors on these transnational issues.
And my last question is actually from my colleague, Dr. Nick Cole from the University of Southern California. He wants to know your assessment of the performance of female and male leaders' management of the pandemic and the way in which women-led places have done better.
Well, I think you can make an argument that many of the countries with female leaders have actually had a pretty good record. If you take, in Europe, the role of Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany, or if you take New Zealand with the role of Jacinda Ardern, they have been models of successful leadership. Now, the questions that sometimes are raised is that just an accident, or could there be something causal about it? There may be something causal about it because of the style of leadership that's often associated with women leadership, which tends to be somewhat more cooperative. It's not invariably true. I mean, there have been women leaders in the past who were quite bellicose, Golda Meir in Israel, or Indira Gandhi in India. So it's not a sure thing that women are always more cooperative. But I think you can make a case, and there have been various studies that have been done, that that women's leadership style often tends to be more cooperative and consensual. And one of the things that seems to be a mark of success for countries in dealing with the pandemic has been a sense of trust and a willingness to cooperate. And so that may be the correlation between female leadership and relative success in dealing with the pandemic.
Maybe a follow-up question could be, do morals matter for women leaders?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think there's a good case that could be made that very often women leaders pay more attention to some of the moral questions. What I try to show in my book by looking at the 14 presidents that the Americans have had since 1945, all of whom, of course, have been male, is that there's a variation between males. Some place a greater emphasis on morality and some do not. But I think when we start having a larger sample of female leaders, we'll be able to do a more careful scientific study of this. But what we've seen from studies of leadership in organizations, not just of countries, is that there is something of a more consensual or less hierarchical attitude in women's leadership styles, and that this often places a higher emphasis on moral issues. So I think it'd be nice to have more women leaders. It'd be nice to have more studies of women leaders. But my hunch is that this hypothesis is correct.
Dr. Nye, thank you very much for a highly informative session. This was an excellent opportunity for the audience and myself to better understand how your analytical concepts would apply in a post-pandemic world. Now we have a few questions from students. So the first question is, some criticize China's mask diplomacy for politicizing the COVID-19 situation. Korea has been promoting its successful response to the COVID-19 internationally. In Korea, it's often called as K-disease prevention and control, like K in K-pop. I'm a bit concerned that the Korea's attempt to promote public values such as public health, disease prevention and control as K-disease prevention and control could be viewed negatively from other countries like the China's mask diplomacy case. In your opinion, how could Korea capitalize on its successful COVID-19 response without it being seen as an attempt to politicize the matter?
Well, I think Korea doesn't have the same problems that China has. China, as I said, has a hard time reconciling mask diplomacy with wolf warrior diplomacy. Korea doesn't have that kind of relationship with its neighbors, and other countries don't feel threatened in the same way that they do feel threatened at times by China. So I think Korea doesn't have the same type of situation that China has. I think Korea also has the benefit of having a good performance record. People admire and are attracted to the way Korea has handled the pandemic so far. So I think Korea actually can take initiatives to have, if you want, Korean face mask diplomacy or K face mask diplomacy without having to worry about the negative reactions that China has encountered.
Okay. And the second question from another student. With the spread of COVID-19, knowledge and expertise on technology and science gained more importance in the area of soft power. Which do you think would dominate in the area of public diplomacy? Science for diplomacy or science in diplomacy?
Well, I think you need both. If you look at public opinion polls, for example, it's interesting that American preeminence in science has often been a very important part of soft power. But it's also true that in the past, the State Department has programs trying to help promote science in other countries and to foster science. So it's both the eminence in science, attraction to countries' own scientific capabilities, and the efforts to cooperate in science by putting a science component into public diplomacy. Both of these are important.
Thank you. A third question from another student. Could you give us a recent example of diplomacy that best utilized countries' soft power that particularly impressed you? Best practices.
Well, it's important not to think that it's only large countries that have soft power. So let me pick some practices from smaller countries. Norway, which is a country with only about 5 million people, and not many people in the world speak Norwegian, but has had a great deal of soft power, which results from the fact that it gives over 1% of its gross domestic product for overseas development assistance, that it's tried to outline a policy which emphasizes issues of peace and peacemaking. And it also has a successful, well-run civil society. So Norway is a small country with a good deal of success in creating soft power. I would say in Asia, Singapore is a similar example. It's a country with, again, only around 5 million people, but its efforts to try to create networks in the educational area in Southeast Asia, as well as its role in promoting ASEAN as an organization for the region, I think have enhanced Singapore's soft power.
Thank you. Another question from another student. Initially, there was a debate about whether the virus causing COVID-19 should be called COVID-19 or Wuhan virus. The US and China were at the center of this controversial issue by using naming and shaming strategies. Do you believe that the intensifying Sino-American competition regarding COVID-19, including the spread of fake news that China produced the virus intentionally, will shift their competition centered on material power to one on ideology?
Well, I worry that ideology may become more important in the U.S.-China relationship on both sides. China is going through a very nationalistic period and insisting on tighter party control as well. And in the United States, some people are talking about a new Cold War, which I think is a misleading metaphor. But it does emphasize more the role of ideology. I think it's better to try to reduce the role of ideology. That's why I would say better to use a term like COVID or coronavirus rather than Wuhan virus. And I think why trying to put blame on the other country is not a very healthy way to deal with it. We're going to have to learn to understand the virus, and not just this virus, but its neighbors and its successors. And again, as I said earlier, the virus doesn't care anything about ideology. It just wants a human to infect and destroy or become its host. So if we are trying to work together and understand and prevent the virus from succeeding, we're going to have to go easy on the ideology, whether it's on China or in the U.S.
Thank you. Last two questions. In your opinion, to what extent could the COVID-19 have a negative impact on globalization?
Well, I think we're already seeing some negative impact on globalization. You obviously see a decrease in air travel as people put up barriers at borders to prevent transmission of the virus internationally. That may change somewhat if successful vaccines are produced and widely distributed. But there's also been a change in attitudes toward supply chains internationally. People used to say you want your supply chain to be just in time. Nowadays, people are saying they also want a supply chain to be just in case. In other words, if there's an interruption in a global supply chain, I don't want it to be dependent upon face masks coming from China. Even if they're cheaper, I want to make sure that I have face masks that I can have closer to home just in case. So I think you're seeing a change in attitudes toward globalization as a result of the pandemic. I don't, however, believe that it's going to end globalization. I think you're going to see some decoupling, particularly in technology areas and security areas. I don't think you're going to see the end of globalization in the economic domain. And we certainly aren't seeing the end of globalization in the ecological areas, which include climate change and pandemics.
Thank you very much. Our last question is going to come from the audience who is with us right now in the studio.
Oh, thank you, Professor, for your lecture today. My name is Jiwon Jung, and as a recent graduate of International Relations from Ewha Women's University, I truly understand the importance of soft power in international relations. So I'd like to appreciate your time, your effort, and your lecture once again. So my question for today is about defining national interest and soft power. You mentioned about morality, and you mentioned about how countries should not defend their national interests, but rather should seek to define their national interests in relation to morality. How does that exactly work? How can countries come up with a sense of enlightened self-interest that not only fulfills their national interests, but also enhances their soft power?
Well, it's a very important question and one that I do try to deal with in this book. But I will take you back to the example I gave of the Marshall Plan after World War II. After World War I, the United States had loaned a great deal of money to Britain and other European countries, and it insisted on repayment. Every penny should be repaid. Well, it couldn't be repaid, so they had to make adjustments and so forth, but there was no effort to put Europe back on its feet. After World War II, President Truman took a different attitude. He said, we're going to have to help Europe get back on its feet. So rather than insisting on the repayment of the money which we've loaned to Britain and the Europeans, we're going to just provide loans and grants, even more important grants, and forgiveness of these payments that are due to us because we need the Europeans to recover, to become stronger. That's in our interest as well as their interest. So that's what I would call the contrast between a narrow definition of self-interest and a broad definition of self-interest. The results of the post-World War I definition of self-interest were, of course, a collapsing Europe and the disastrous decade of the 1930s. The results of the broader definition of self-interest in the 40s was a period of European growth and stability. So I think the moral implications of the two types of definitions are pretty clear in terms of the larger geopolitical effects.
Thank you.
Dr. Nye, it was a great pleasure hosting you today. We would have loved to host you in person in Korea, but due to the pandemic, we were forced to have a recorded session instead. I hope we will have another opportunity in the near future to welcome you to Korea. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I always enjoy my visits to Korea, so I hope post-COVID I'll be able to do it again. And good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you all for watching the keynote session with Dr. Joseph Nye of the Korea Foundation's third Public Diplomacy Week. Stay tuned for more virtual events coming from Korea Foundation. Thank you.